Hey there, everybody, and welcome to another session of the Second Tuesday Photo Huddle. Watch for more from the Second Tuesday Photo Huddle on the West Michigan Photography Enthusiast group on meetup.com. The West Michigan Photography Enthusiast group is sponsored by the Southwestern Michigan Council of Camera Clubs, swmccc.org. This time on the Second Tuesday Photo Huddle, let's look into hyperfocal distance with Mike Mitchell. Take it away, Mike.
One thing that as photographers, we're always striving for sharp in focus images. And there's a number of factors relating to sharp images. And one of them is, if we're using a tripod with a mirror lockup function, if we have that in our camera, we can get rid of unsharp images because of camera movement. But today we're going to talk about a topic that, we want to maximize our zone of acceptable sharpness. And this will work with any photo or any photographic lens. So we're going to talk about hyperfocal distance, and this first slide here shows us kind of is an explanation of what hyperfocal distance is. And basically it's a distance that's we focus at a spot in our scene, and we have the acceptable sharpness from ahead of the point, closer to us, and then all the way to infinity is kind of the idea. And the distance in hyperfocal distance depends on what lens you're shooting with, what focal length, and what aperture you're shooting at. This is the calculation, find hyperfocal distance, but
what is this acceptable circle of confusion?
I'm not going to explain that because it's kind of a goofy concept. It's got to do with how big your area of sharpness is on your film or your sensor.
Mike, I put a link to a quick video that explains the whole acceptable circle of confusion aspect.
Here's one method to set your hyperfocal distance, and that's using a hyperfocal distance chart. So basically, first you choose your lens and you make note of what focal length you're using if you're using, say, a zoom lens, okay? Then you pick the aperture value that you want to shoot at, and then you look, and we'll show you because the next slide we have a chart, but then you find the hyperfocal distance that corresponds to your focal length and your aperture, and then you set your lens at that distance. And if you don't have a distance scale on your lens, there are some that are like that, you can kind of estimate it or use the focusing scale that's on the lens. And now everything from half the distance, half that focal hyperfocal distance to infinity should be sharp. So let's say we're shooting with 50 millimeter focal length. Look at 50, and then you go across and you've got what the hyperfocal distance is for all the apertures underneath. So let's say it's bright out, we're gonna shoot at f16. Our hyperfocal distance would be about 17 1/3 or so feet. Now, so what that would mean is anything from about half of 17 feet, so like about 8 foot to infinity, should be in focus. These charts are available online. This is just a small section of a larger chart that had more focal lengths. This is kind of cool. On a lot of lenses, they'll have a scale. A lot of the newer zoom lenses and stuff don't have this kind of thing, but a lot of prime lenses and some of the older lenses have a scale like this, which is pretty handy. Now, if you look at this, you'll notice you got your aperture ring and you've got your scale from infinity to whatever in meters and feet up above. You got that center long line, that's your focus point. So on this one, they've got the way you use a scale, if you want to figure out what your hyperfocal length distance is set the infinity mark next to the aperture that you want to use. So like in this case, it's across from 22. So if you look at 22 on the left side, and then you look at f22 on the right side, that'll tell you what your whole distance is. So from about 0.7 meters to infinity will be in focus with the lens focused at that spot. But you'll notice you've got a line for different apertures. So you do the same thing if you were shooting at f11, just adjust the focus so that the infinity mark is across from f11. And then you go over to f11 here, and it'll tell you what your closest focus is going to be. This is an old zoom lens. This kind of gives you a little better idea. If you see how you got the focal lengths over here on the right side, 75 millimeter, 60 millimeter, 50 millimeter. See how it kind of fans out depending on what aperture you're set at. So it kind of gives you an idea shorter focal length, you're going to get a bigger hyperfocal distance at the same aperture. So that's using a scale on a lens. There's a lot of smartphone apps. So if you go out and do a quick search in the App Store for hyperfocal or depth of field calculator, and it should give you any number of useful apps that you can use. I got one on my phone. It's called Hyperfocal. So it's kind of cool. You just run it, and it's got places to put in all the information, and it'll calculate out what your hyperfocal distance is for whatever aperture, lens, focal length combination you got. I kind of looked through different ones. I think this one was $1.99. There's some that were free. That's pretty easy because you usually got your phone with you. Okay, now here's sort of a rule of thumb. On any scene that you want most of the image sharp, focus on something that's about a third of the way into the image. And that'll give you your biggest depth of field at any given aperture. So like on this particular shot of the lighthouse, I probably focused in at about, you see there's kind of a shelf right in the foreground, and then there's kind of lines where there's seams. Probably that second seam up, that's probably the area that I focused on. Someplace in that area, about a third of the way in. This was a wide angle lens and probably stopped down, pretty small. I'd probably say 11 or 16, something like that. So, with a wide angle lens and stop down that far, you'll get a large hyperfocal distance. So when do you use hyperfocal distance? Well, one thing you can do is in landscapes, especially when you have things where you want the foreground and the distance to be on sharp focus. So, kind of a near far kind of thing. If you're doing a landscape that's, you're shooting a mountain range, it's way in the back and you don't really have much in the foreground, it doesn't really matter. Just focus how you would normally, but if you really want to, be pretty good about getting that huge range, that's a good time to use the whole focal distance. It's also good, like I say, doing tabletop photography, especially if you've got a bit of depth in your subject, So, in this case, I probably would have focused on the bottom of the second glass in, kind of thing. The other thing too is a lot of people either don't know how to use it or don't like to use it, you can push your depth of field preview button down and it'll stop your lens down, and you can actually physically see what your depth of field is going to be, or pretty close. The only thing is, a lot of people don't like it because you're closing your aperture, actually physically closing your aperture down, and it makes the image dark. So that's just a matter of practice using that. I use that all the time. But it's just, I'm used to doing it. So, but it's amazing how you can kind of avoid a misfocus, with your depth of field preview, just to make sure, just to kind of double check. Does hyperfocal distance fail? Yes, it does. Usually it's the thing where you're really trying to get such a deep focus that physically, if you're stopped down all the way to say f22 or f32, you're like on this one, just the front edges of this snow fence are just a little out of focus. There just wasn't enough, for what aperture I was using. I can't really say if on this particular one, if I was stopped down all the way or not, but even if I was, like I say, you run into this where the distance is just bigger than physically what the lens can actually give you, as far as a depth of field. And what do you do when it fails? Well, there's one thing you could do, like on that fence shot. I probably could have taken 2 or 3 steps backwards and then just cropped my image once I got it shot to fill the frame the way I had it. But sometimes that doesn't work, just because I wanted the distortion of being up close to the fence. You might not get that if you step back a little bit. So that's one way to do it. You can use a technique called focus stacking if you really need that extra, depth of field in your landscape or something like that. Focus stacking is common in macro and product photography and landscape photography also. And basically it involves capturing a series of images at different focus points, and then you combine them in Photoshop or some kind of software. There's a software out there called Helicon Focus that I've used before that works pretty slick, except it's kind of an expensive piece of software. And then you make that image that's fully in focus. So that's pretty good. But the thing about it is you have to take multiple images in order to do it. So obviously your camera is going to have to be on a tripod, and you can't have things moving around in the image while you're recording all these different images. It doesn't work. You get funny looking things.
So Mike, if you weren't even trying to calculate this, if you're sitting here, you've got some stuff over here, you've got something of significance here, and then for infinity, you may want to try to focus, without doing the calculations, you could kind of focus right here, and that's going to probably give you the same effect as going through all the calculations in the tables.
Yeah, all you're doing, it's like I say, consider that maybe about a third of the way into the depth of the shot. Okay. The thing about it is if you're farther away from things, like, you got the mountains and stuff in the background, and this rock probably is not going to, unless it's like, right up in your face, that's going to be a ways away, so right. Yeah. See, this is a case where you could focus on the rock. Okay. Yes. From that point, that half where it says half hyperfocal distance to infinity, that should be in focus.
Here's the quick thing. If you're going to use a chart, as Mike says, choose a lens, know the focal length, pick the aperture value, find the focal length distance on the chart, just like we have here.
Thing about it is as you notice, as the longer the focal length gets at any particular aperture, your distance changes.
Remember that you're going to want to take half the distance that's shown on the hyperfocal distance chart to give you the items in the foreground that are going to be in the acceptable focus area. Quick look at the chart. A 16 millimeter lens at f11 has a much shorter 2.5 feet hyperfocal distance than an 85 millimeter lens does at f11, 70 feet for its hyperfocal distance. Remember to take half of that to get your acceptable range of focus.
If you do a Google search for hyperfocal distance chart, you can find all kinds of information. And just like the apps are pretty handy. The apps are probably the handiest way to determine what your hyperfocal distance is for any focal length, or some of the depth of field calculators that are out there. So I use it all the time, really without thinking. I probably do the focus in 1/3 of the distance.
Thanks, Mike. So there you have it, folks. You have a few ways of getting all of what you want in the scene in acceptable focus. You can use a scale on your lens if there is one, consult a hyperfocal distance chart, use an interactive app, or pick a spot about 1/3 of the way into your scene. Using this last method, you can use a depth of field preview on your camera to get a good look at what your scene will look like. But remember the definition of hyperfocal distance. It's the closest focusing distance that allows objects at infinity to be acceptably sharp. And to keep objects in the foreground acceptably sharp, the distance from you and your camera to that foreground object needs to be 1/2 of the hyperfocal distance that you found. Above all, get out there and play around with composition and focusing. That's it for now then. If you do have any questions, shoot me an email, leave a message on Meetup. Thanks, Mike, for stepping us through that. I hope you all enjoyed it. Now look for more from the Second Tuesday Photo Huddle. Be sure to check out the West Michigan Photography Enthusiasts on meetup.com. The West Michigan Photography Enthusiasts Meetup Group is sponsored by the Southwestern Michigan Council of Camera Clubs. That's swmccc.org. Look for more at their website for upcoming information on our annual conference. And you can find me at michaelcool.com.